Dandelion and burdock. Fermented dandelion and burdock drink with herbal extract. What? Okay, for all my folks in the
Don't feel bad for missing your partner after just a few days apart. That longing is natural and not something to be ashamed of. Likewise, in entertainment, emotion and perception can quickly shape public opinion, as seen with Disney's controversial decision to cast Rachel Zegler as Snow White. What began as a routine casting announcement turned into one of Hollywood's biggest cultural debates long before the film's release. Fans, critics, and even satirical voices like South Park joined the conversation, transforming the project into a symbol of broader tensions over remakes, representation, and creative reinterpretation. From the start, Zegler's casting ignited passionate reactions. The very name, Snow White, traditionally refers to the character's fair complexion, white as snow. For some, casting a Latina actress seemed like an intentional shift from the original depiction, sparking claims that Disney was rewriting a beloved classic for political correctness. Others, however, praised the decision as a meaningful act of progress, celebrating diversity and the idea that timeless stories can evolve to reflect a more inclusive world. Instead of generating excitement, Disney's casting of Rachel Zegler as Snow White ignited a firestorm that lasted for months. Social media became a battlefield of opinions. Think pieces flooded entertainment sites, and YouTubers dissected every angle, debating whether Disney's decision was brave, performative, or outright misguided. Yet the controversy didn't stop at the casting. When new details about the plot emerged, fans realized this wasn't a light update to a familiar fairy tale. It was a complete reinvention. In this version, Snow White wouldn't be defined by her relationship with a prince. Gone was the traditional romance. In its place stood a strong, self-reliant leader shaping her own fate, and according to some reports, even leading a quiet revolution. For some, it was a refreshing and empowering rewrite. For others, it felt like Disney had stripped away the soul of a classic, replacing it with a character that barely resembled the original. The Seven Dwarfs, too, were reimagined, redesigned to avoid old stereotypes, and replaced with a more modern, symbolic ensemble. To many longtime fans, the project began to feel less like a remake and more like a completely new story disguised as Snow White. Rachel Zegler herself didn't help calm the storm. Instead of taking a diplomatic approach, she leaned into the criticism, calling the 1937 film outdated and problematic, arguing that the new version would fix those flaws. In one viral moment, she even joked about disliking apple-flavored snacks on set, a lighthearted comment that, to critics, came off as tone-deaf toward one of the story's most iconic symbols. What might have been dismissed as a playful remark became proof, in the eyes of skeptics, that she didn't truly respect the source material. Soon, the internet was buzzing with a new question. Did Rachel Zegler even like Snow White? That was the atmosphere into which South Park stepped. And true to form, they wasted no time turning the entire situation into biting satire. Famous for satire that cuts deeper than simple mockery, South Park's Into the Panderverse episode delivered one of its sharpest commentaries yet, using Disney's Snow White controversy as the perfect symbol of Hollywood's identity crisis. The episode flipped the familiar cast on its head. Cartman was turned into a bold female protagonist, Stan was recast with a new ethnicity, and even Kenny and Butters were barely recognizable. The absurdity was hilarious, but it also struck an uncomfortable truth. The brilliance of the episode wasn't just in the laughs, it was in the message. South Park wasn't mocking diversity itself, it was attacking the motives behind it. The show accused studios of pretending to champion representation, while merely recycling old stories with superficial changes. In their view, Hollywood wasn't advancing inclusivity, but commodifying it, turning identity into a marketing tool rather than a meaningful narrative choice. That criticism landed hard. Viewers frustrated by endless reboots and shallow virtue signaling felt the episode voiced what they'd been thinking all along. Soon after, reports surfaced suggesting Disney wasn't amused. Rumors claimed executives were quietly furious, feeling the parody had cut too close to home. The irony was hard to miss. A group of crude animated kids had just called out billion-dollar corporate hypocrisy in a way no major outlet dared to. In the end, South Park's clash with Disney wasn't just another pop culture skirmish. It became a larger metaphor for the growing rift between audiences and mega studios. Ordinary people armed with humor and criticism pushing back against Hollywood's polished attempts to dictate the cultural narrative. And fittingly, it wasn't even their first round. South Park has been taking on Disney's sanctimony for years, and Into the Panderverse proved they're nowhere near done. Over the years, South Park has skewered nearly every corner of Disney's empire. From Star Wars to Frozen, Mickey Mouse himself has been portrayed as a ruthless, profit-obsessed tyrant. But their Snow White parody felt different. More than a jab at one movie, it tapped into a deeper cultural frustration. Audiences are growing weary of Hollywood's endless loop of remakes, reboots, and hollow updates that seem to value messaging over genuine creativity. For many, Disney's upcoming Snow White became the perfect symbol of this phenomenon, a textbook example of how not to modernize a beloved classic. Even before its release, the film had outgrown its own narrative. It now represents a broader clash: nostalgia versus modernity, artistic risk versus corporate caution, authentic inclusivity versus surface-level pandering. Whether it ultimately succeeds or flops at the box office, its legacy as a cultural flashpoint is already sealed. South Park may have delivered the funniest critique, but the conversation it sparked about Hollywood's creative direction is far from over. Caught in the middle of it all is Rachel Zegler. Once simply a rising star stepping into a dream role, she now finds herself the face of a much larger debate, one that transcends her performance or career. On one hand, she embodies opportunity and representation. On the other, she's become a lightning rod for public frustration with Disney and the entertainment industry's obsession with modernizing everything. South Park's Into the Panderverse didn't just mock Snow White, it dismantled the system behind it. The episode painted Hollywood as an industry so fixated on optics and diversity checklists that it has lost touch with the heart of storytelling. The satire was brutal. Cartman transformed into an over-the-top, strong female lead, who shouted empty empowerment slogans. Stan was given a forced ethnicity change. Kenny and Butters were reduced to token background figures. It was hilarious, exaggerated, and uncomfortably on point. Beneath the absurdity lay a serious question, one that continues to echo across audiences and critics alike. When Hollywood redefines its characters and stories in the name of progress, is it truly about inclusion? Or just clever marketing disguised as virtue? That question hit a cultural nerve, and it's not going away anytime soon. Some praised South Park for daring to say what few others would: that recycling old characters with new faces isn't innovation, it's creative complacency. Others dismissed the episode as anti-woke, but its underlying critique was difficult to ignore. True representation, the show argued, comes from building new worlds, creating original characters, and giving fresh voices a platform, not from running classic fairy tales through the filter of modern social media ideals. Meanwhile, Rachel Zegler found herself thrust into an unwanted spotlight. Every interview clip, every soundbite, every half-sentence pulled out of context became viral fodder. Her remark calling the 1937 Snow White outdated and weird played on repeat across the internet. When she spoke about fair streaming residuals for actors, her words were twisted from advocacy into arrogance. The problem wasn't necessarily what she said, it was how it was perceived. Fans who cherished the original felt dismissed, as if the story that defined their childhoods was now being ridiculed. Even her lighthearted joke about disliking apple-flavored snacks was seized upon as proof that she didn't respect the role. That's where the resentment began to build. To lifelong Disney fans, Snow White wasn't just another film, it was a landmark, the foundation of Disney's entire legacy. Watching it reinterpreted as a vessel for empowerment slogans, stripped of its whimsy and warmth, felt like betrayal. Then came the trailer, and the divide only deepened. The visuals were darker, the tone heavier, the prince entirely removed, and the dwarfs replaced with a completely new concept. What remained was a murky plot about a stolen crown and self-discovery, a story that might have worked as an original movie but felt misplaced under the Snow White banner. To some, this was progress at last, a bold step toward inclusivity, a princess defined by ambition rather than romance. But to others, it felt like a bait and switch, a beloved classic repackaged to sell a message they never asked for. What audiences had really wanted was the story they grew up loving, not a lecture, not a rebrand, but the same timeless magic that once defined Disney. South Park took all that pent-up frustration and turned it into razor-sharp comedy. Their parody didn't simply mock Rachel Zegler or Disney. It pulled back the curtain on the entire system driving these creative choices. The show painted a picture of an industry obsessed with optics, more focused on how something reads in a press release than whether it moves or inspires its audience. Beneath the absurdity, the message was brutally clear. What Hollywood was serving wasn't art anymore. It was marketing. And uncomfortably, millions agreed. For years, Hollywood has seemed less like a creator of dreams and more like a reactor to trends, chasing hashtags, tweaking scripts to avoid backlash, and following algorithms instead of instinct. When a show like South Park becomes the loudest voice of reason in that chaos, it signals just how far the balance has tilted. Disney's silence on the parody only added to the intrigue. Officially, there were no public statements, no fiery rebuttals. But behind the scenes, industry whispers suggested the company had quietly reached out to the South Park creators, hoping to avoid being roasted again in future episodes. If true, that speaks volumes. Disney is a machine known for precision and control, and it doesn't flinch unless something truly hits a nerve. The fact that a cartoon could shake such a corporate giant was, in itself, telling. Executives reportedly feared that the laughter might evolve into something more dangerous, a genuine loss of faith in the Disney brand. It wasn't an unfounded fear. For nearly a decade, Disney's live-action remake pipeline, Aladdin, Mulan, The Little Mermaid, The Lion King, and now Snow White, has been running non-stop. But each release has chipped away at audience patience. The novelty is gone. The nostalgia has dulled. And once the audience starts laughing at your formula instead of with it, it's only a matter of time before they stop buying tickets altogether. That's what made South Park's satire so devastating. It wasn't just funny, it was diagnostic. It pinpointed the exact moment where magic turned into marketing, where imagination gave way to repetition. In the end, it didn't just make people laugh, it made them see the pattern. Endless reboots, checkbox casting, recycled PR buzzwords, all signs that Hollywood's greatest illusion may no longer be its storytelling, but its ability to convince us we're still watching something new. At the center of this storm stands Rachel Zegler, a young actress who, whether she intended to or not, has become the face of a cultural divide far larger than any one film. To some, she represents progress and a long overdue shift in Hollywood's definition of who gets to play the heroine. To others, she has come to symbolize the industry's growing arrogance and disconnect from its own audience. Either way, she now carries the weight of frustrations aimed not just at her, but at an entire system more focused on branding than on storytelling. For Zegler, the opportunity was monumental. Landing the role of Snow White wasn't just another step in a rising career. It was a chance to inhabit one of the most iconic characters in cinematic history, a figure cherished by generations. But with that legacy came immense pressure. The spotlight was merciless and the scrutiny even harsher. Some of the criticism hurled at her was downright cruel, driven more by viral outrage than thoughtful analysis. Yet not all of it was baseless. Heritage characters occupy a sacred space in popular culture. They're not just fictional figures. They're pieces of collective memory. When an actor seems to show more disdain for the original story than affection for it, it can feel like a personal affront to those who grew up loving it. Audiences don't return to the old Disney films merely for the artistry or nostalgia. They return for the feeling, the simplicity, the warmth, the emotional purity that made those stories timeless. But that magic becomes fragile when it's smothered by politics, self-awareness, and corporate messaging. When a fairy tale stops enchanting and starts preaching, something essential slips away. South Park captured that exhaustion perfectly. Beneath its wild humor, the show exposed the growing cultural fatigue, the sense that every new movie now arrives with a moral checklist, that characters are no longer people but symbols. Instead of being swept up in a world of imagination, audiences are asked to decode statements about representation, gender, and social virtue. The result? A trip to the theater starts feeling less like an escape and more like a lecture disguised as entertainment. The irony, of course, is that audiences do want inclusion. They crave stories that reflect the diversity and complexity of the world around them. They want new heroes, fresh voices, and genuine perspectives. But more than anything, they want sincerity, representation that feels organic, not engineered, storytelling that feels heartfelt, not branded. True progress, as South Park so bitingly reminded us, can't be manufactured in a boardroom. It has to come from the heart. A story born from a creator's genuine passion, not from a corporate focus group or a marketing checklist, is what separates art that resonates from content that merely preaches. True representation isn't about repainting old characters with new faces. It's about building new worlds, new myths, and new icons from the ground up. Imagine if Disney had introduced an entirely original Latina princess, a character with her own mythology, her own struggles, her own sense of wonder, instead of rebranding a European fairy tale. That would feel authentic. That would feel bold. And it would give someone like Rachel Zegler the chance to define a legacy, not inherit one. But Hollywood rarely takes such risks. Reinventing a familiar story is safer than investing in an untested one. It's easier to bet on nostalgia than to nurture innovation. And so, the cycle continues. Another remake, another reboot, another coat of digital polish on a story we've already seen. Yet, the well they keep returning to is starting to run dry. South Park's parody didn't just make fun of this, it exposed the fatigue behind it. Audiences are growing tired, no longer fooled by slogans about bold new visions, when the product beneath is simply a repackaged past. The younger generation especially sees right through it. They live online, fluent in irony and authenticity, and they can sense when a story has been algorithmically assembled. They scroll past corporate creativity in seconds, finding more meaning in memes, independent films, and content from creators who speak with sincerity rather than strategy. They're not looking for perfect optics, they're looking for heart. In the end, that's the real danger for Disney and actors like Rachel Zegler. Not the possibility of a box office disappointment, but the risk of something far deeper, losing the audience's trust. Because once people stop believing in the magic and start seeing only the machinery behind it, the spell is broken. And no amount of marketing can bring it back. No amount of marketing can bring it back.